Welcome to the MacMillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Ardis Butterfield, the John M. Schiff Professor of English and Professor of French and Music at Yale. She specializes on the works of Chaucer, literatures of France and England from the 13th to 15th centuries, and on medieval music, as well as on theories and histories of language, form and genre, city writing, and bilingualism and medieval linguistic identities. Professor Butterfield's books include The Familiar Enemy, Chaucer, Language and the Nation in the 100 Years' War, and Poetry and Music in Medieval France. She edited Chaucer and the City, a collection of essays. She also co-founded the Medieval Song Network, a collaborative international project to encourage new interdisciplinary research on the medieval lyric. Today we talk with Professor Butterfield about medieval English lyrics and Chaucer. Welcome, Professor Butterfield.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation.
You are a very busy woman. You're currently working on 3 book projects. One is a new edition of medieval English lyrics for Norton. The second is a book on lyric and form, and then lastly, of course, your biography of Chaucer. So why don't you give us a little bit of an overview of each of them?
Okay, well, the 2 lyric projects are related in the sense that I'm working on an edition of medieval English lyrics, and then writing the book about lyric that comes out of the research that I'm doing for that. That's the theory. It's in practice quite hard to write a book and an edition all at once. And then the biography is something I was commissioned to do a long time ago, in fact, and I've been working away at it off and on, wondering how to write a biography of a medieval author. And so that project is sort of ticking away and gradually happening, gradually seeing the light.
Okay. I am curious as to what led you to be interested in this line of work.
Well, I have always been interested in writing, in literature, and in music, and I suppose I took a turn as a graduate student and went deep into French literature of the Middle Ages, and then, as it were, came back to England a little bit later, although I was teaching in English literature all the way through. So I've been fascinated by the links between England and France in the Middle Ages. I've also been fascinated by the links between poetry and music in the Middle Ages. So there's a continuity in the kinds of interests that I have. Okay.
And what exactly is a lyric? I mean, versus a poem, versus a song, are they all the same thing?
That's such a good question. It's actually very hard to be hard and fast about these things. In fact, many people would argue right now, it's very interesting how people are rethinking what we mean by lyric right now. And many people are arguing that our notions of lyric currently are very much formed from the Romantic period and later, but that these are attitudes towards poetry that were really in some ways invented by literary criticism. Because when you go back through the centuries, you find that people are much less anxious about what lyric might be. Yes, if there's music, then it's a song, but we like to think of lyric now as being something much more specific. We think of it as being to do with love, to do with personal emotion, all sorts of personal anguish that comes to the surface.
Okay, and you did bring one with you today. Would you like to read it for us?
Well, one of the things I'm really interested in the Middle Ages is whether we really want to use this word lyric, but also whether the kinds of short verse that people used and wrote and composed and listened to were the same as ones that we listen to now. And I just thought I'd read out to you a couple. I'm not going to sing any, I'm afraid.
But, are they normally sung, though?
Well, there's definitely, on the continent, that a huge number survive with music. In England, sadly, most of the music has disappeared, so just a handful are left with music. But this is one, you see, that I think might sound to many people as very modern. And it goes, "Western wind, when wilt thou blow? The small rain down can rain. Christ, if my love were in my arms, and I in my bed again." And that's a 15th century text. It's probably earlier than that. And that survives with music, but in a very religious setting, interestingly. There's another one which is a lullaby, just to give you some idea of it, which is just lullaby. Lulle, lulle, little child, why weepest thou so sore? And then that little refrain comes up many, many times across different texts with different sorts of words added to it. And so there's a very fluid sort of combination of different sorts of texts and melodies that float around in the culture.
So now, did anyone write lyrics, or yes, everyone could have written them?
Well, that's right. One of the things about the Middle Ages is that so much that's come down to us is anonymous. We've lost all track of who wrote things. There are some big author figures. There is, of course, Geoffrey Chaucer, that I expect many people know. But he was relatively late in the period, and there are some other named figures. But in general, we have thousands of examples of short verse with no specific name attached to them that we can now discover. What's interesting is that, yes, I mean, people presumably were composing and producing songs and short verse all over the place, which has not been written down. So we always have to remember that there's a vast amount that was in oral circulation, and what we have in writing was just really the tip of the iceberg.
So given that lyrics were oral, but of course some of them were also written down, how do you go about doing the research for the books that you're working on?
Well, it's quite hard work in the sense that, especially in England, there are many, many manuscripts of very varied types in which short verse gets copied. And although most of it has been catalogued, not all of it has. And if it has been catalogued, only in quite brief terms. So you actually have to go and spend a lot of time, which I love, working with medieval manuscripts. Most of these are in Oxford and London and Cambridge. And trying to locate the short verse, identify it, copy it down, and understand its context. And one of the interesting things that really fascinates me about the period, especially in England, is that lyrics written in English are very often copied with material in French and Latin, and they're not until much later in the period copied together, collected. So there isn't really such thing as a lyric anthology until the 14th century, by and large. And so you have to sort of dig around and find things, and find there may be quite a lot of lyrics in one manuscript. They won't necessarily be grouped as types. So that's something that you know adds to the pleasure of the hunt.
It's interesting to me to go back to that time period and have these lyrics being written and sung. And when you say there's music with them, when they're copied out, and are they typically copied out in English, even though Latin and French was the languages of the literary day in England?
Yes, well, that's right. One of the things we observe is that more and more lyrics get copied in English. So to begin with, it's very rare to find lyrics in English.
Okay.
In the 13th century, there are very few, relatively speaking, far more in French and Latin.
Okay.
But that, as time goes on and English asserts itself more as a literary language, then people are more comfortable copying things down in English. But it's true that that's really one reason why there's quite it's quite an effort to locate English words in, if you like, in a sea of French and Latin.
Now, in terms of the music, how does it accompany the lyric? Is it written out in musical form, and then someone would have to have musical knowledge to do that?
You're quite right. Music, the ability to write down music has always been a specialist activity.
Right.
I mean, even now, not everybody can do it. So the people who are writing the music in the Middle Ages were trained, literate, usually clerics of some kind. So, but it's interesting because what the clerics are used to doing is copying religious material, the Mass, liturgy, and music in Latin. So they're having to think harder about how to actually copy something that has very different sorts of words and a function that may not be immediately apparent to them. So often the music is a little bit more scrappy than certainly in the big books, and some of it is very funny actually. There's a 15th century book that I'm very fond of, which was probably owned by a student in Oxford who was a chorister, and his book is wonderfully messy. It's a complete mess of information of all kinds, science and literature and law, and he has about 20 songs copied, many of them very erotic, very obscene, with little bits of music here and there. So that's an example of a book that's quite late in the period that I'm working with, that isn't actually very easy to work with because it's in such a state.
I am still curious, though, about people writing lyrics, these lyrics, and then do they have to go to yet another person to help them work out the musical aspects of it?
Well, one of the things that we often conclude is that people don't write down the music so that someone else can read or perform from it. Often the writing down of the music is a way of recording that song in some way for posterity, if you like, or in some way for someone else to use. But there isn't always a direct relationship between, I'm going to copy this down because someone wants to sing it. People were had the facility of their memories far more than we do now, because they had to. There were fewer books that people were able to access. So I think the world of oral composition and oral performance was a very, very large part of people's lives, and the writing down was a relatively small part of what people were up to. Again, these things change, and you have to be very alert to the period to understand the right kind of context to assume.
Now, are there any rules when it comes to lyric? I mean, you know, for instance, I think of haiku, and there's very definite rules that go along with that. Is it similar for the lyric, or no?
That's also a really good question, because in some ways there are certainly rules for French and Latin composition. No one even thought of having rules for composition in English until much, much later. There wasn't even a grammar for English until the 17th century, really. People assumed that if you wanted to treat a language seriously, that English wasn't an appropriate language to do that with. So it's an interesting question that in some ways I'm really researching. I'm trying to understand when people write verse, what kinds of principles they had in mind, because there's so much variety. There's a huge amount of variety, and some of it, to be honest, looks to us, again, quite scrappy, unformed, the kind of material where you could go on and it wouldn't really matter where you stopped. And so much of it is interpolated and chopped about and reinserted in different contexts, that, again, this notion that a song had to have a kind of pure organic form doesn't seem to be uppermost in people's minds, at least in many cases.
Okay. I am curious also about when these lyrics were being written, how they were used in everyday life.
Well, we have so little evidence to go on, really. We have more evidence from the later end of the period, and it does seem as if people, in the 15th century, for example, there's a wonderful stack of letters where clearly people exchanged lyrics as love lyrics, you know, in the way that we think people might do in later periods, and people do now, the more sentimental of us. So there is that tradition. There is very much a tradition of exchanging, if you like, a kind of language of love that will appeal not just to the woman or to the man of your dreams, but really to your social peers, to make you look like someone who is very literate and articulate and able to compose in this sort of elegant style. But many lyrics have a devotional function. In a way, this is the primary sort of difference between the Middle Ages and our own, perhaps, that people wrote verse to concentrate on being able to contemplate the crucifixion, different stages of the church year. They wrote many pieces of short verse to the Virgin. This is part of a way of focusing their minds on the important eternal matters of life and death, and to put away earthly concerns. There are many lyrics about death. There are many lyrics reminding one that death is inevitable and that one must get oneself in order morally and spiritually for that reason.
Right. All right, let's move to your work on Chaucer, whom many people know him primarily for the Canterbury Tales, although he is a very interesting man in that he's had he has a wide range of interests, from alchemy to philosophy to astronomy even, and you are writing a biography on him. So tell us a little bit about that process and how you're doing the research around it.
Yes, Chaucer is a great poet, and that's how we think of him now. Ironically, this is well known to Chaucer scholars, that there's quite a fat book of documents that survive about him. Not a single one mentions him as a writer, not a single one. So if you only had that bunch of documents, you would have no actual evidence that Chaucer was the poet that we know now. We have other reasons, of course, for assigning all this poetry to him. So it is a real puzzle for a biographer, or at least a very different kind of project from writing a biography of someone much more recent, for whom thousands of letters might survive, and reminiscences and people able to talk about this person. We have nothing like that for Chaucer. So this is both a challenge and a problem, if you like, but one of the ways in which I have tackled this is to very much think of Chaucer in his location in London. And when I started this biography, I was teaching and living in London, and it was a matter for me of daily life to walk past parts of the river that Chaucer would have known, or stand in locations where we know he lived. Of course, modern London has is transformed from its medieval past, and there was a great fire in the 17th century that destroyed many medieval buildings. But nonetheless, it's a location that is full of history, and certain aspects and views are the same. And we have Westminster Abbey, amongst other many corners of the medieval past lurking in the modern city. So one of the things I'm trying to do is really use the city as a way of thinking about the imaginative process in Chaucer, and trying to understand how he saw things, how he was stimulated by the locations in which he worked, the streets down which he walked. And I'm also interested very much in the river, because the River Thames was a great thoroughfare in the Middle Ages. It's becoming more of that now in modern London again. It's a great underused resource, if you like, for travel. And in the Middle Ages, people went up and down. It's thick with boats. So one of the ways I'm really thinking about the biography is through the River Thames, through its actual capacity to transport people around the city, but also its symbolic and imaginative capacity to create a sort of picture of how people, and how Chaucer in particular, took elements from life and transformed them through his imagination into poetry.
I have read, and I could be incorrect, that Chaucer was very helpful in having more lyrics written in English. Is that true or no?
Yes, Chaucer was interesting because he wrote in English. He was the first poet, well, he's an unusual case in every respect, but so he wrote entirely, it seems, exclusively in English, although that's the only language in which his poetry survives. It's quite likely he wrote some in French as well, but they haven't survived. Whereas his contemporaries wrote in Latin and French as well. Chaucer clearly made a decision to write in English. The reason, therefore, is that he was deeply influential on English poetry ever afterwards. And so we have a lot of writing that's clearly been written because Chaucer wrote anything at all in English. What was your question?
That he was very instrumental in getting lyrics written more and more in English versus Latin or French.
One of the things that's remarkable, though, about Chaucer is a kind of paradox, is that he writes in English, but he writes so often through French poetry that he absolutely knew thoroughly. And there's a funny kind of way in which his writing is more French than English, though it happens to be written in English. And the French poetry of the time was the dominant aesthetic cultural language and culture of the time. And so in some ways, Chaucer was the mediator of that vitally important culture into the English language. It was already an important aspect of English life. You know, the aristocracy had been marrying into French and France throughout centuries. And in Chaucer's own lifetime, Edward III and Richard II were themselves thoroughly continental monarchs. And Richard II was brought up in France and had a French mother and would have spoken French as his mother tongue almost certainly. So there is a huge context in England for welcoming, understanding, being utterly familiar with French culture. And Chaucer's role, if you like, was to just tip that into English.
Very good. Well, thank you so much for being here with us today and sharing some of your work.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
For more information about Professor Butterfield and her research, please visit our website at yale.edu/MacMillan Report. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the MacMillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty MacMillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That is fascinating.